afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. It's a pleasure to welcome you here today to the Center for Global Development for this event. There are few countries with as much potential as South Africa. Um, Somehow here in Washington, we don't talk as much about South Africa. As Alan suggested, maybe it's because it's a middle income country in Africa. There is a quip for people who follow Brazil. They describe Brazil as the country of the future, and it always will be. And in a way, South Africa sort of plays into that. It is a country with tremendous potential, but over the last 2 decades, at least South Africa has underperformed that potential. Today, we want to talk about some of that, the issues with growth in South Africa, the issues with the South African economy, governance in South Africa, and there are few people more qualified to address that question than our guest today. Anne Bernstein is the head of the Center for Development Enterprise, a leading think tank in South Africa. Um, the center focuses on growth, unemployment, education, and the role of business in society. She's an author, she's a thinker, a writer, and was a member of the transition team back then on the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa from 1994 to 2000. She was a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy from 2000 and in 2005. And in 2007, she joined the Bernstein Foundation board. In subsequent years, she's been invited as a faculty member at the World Economic Forum in Davos and a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Her book, The Case for Business and Development Economics and Developing Economies, received favorable reviews, not just in South Africa, from around the world. It is thus our pleasure today to welcome Anne here at the Center for Global Development, where she'll be speaking a bit before she has a conversation with Alan and I. Anne, over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Gyude, for that great introduction. I am going to start with South Africa's potential as well, although we hadn't talked about it. So I run an unusual organization in a complex developing country. And in the next 15 minutes, I'm going to cover some of the key issues about South Africa today. Now, South Africa is one of the few mineral-rich countries that is middle income. Most of the mineral-rich countries are low-income, fragile states. Some of them are failed states. We have a democratic constitution, and we've had many successful, pretty much free and fair elections since 1994. We have an independent judiciary. We have freedom of media and many other democratic freedoms and independent institutions that have been specially created by our Constitution. We have a world-class and independent reserve bank and a good national treasury, well respected around the world. We're a large country with enormous potential for tourism. We have a diverse and deep mineral resource endowment, if you like, both the old stuff when it comes to minerals, as well as many of the new minerals that are going to be essential for green energy. We have a system of cities that is very unusual in the developing world, where many countries have one major city that is overwhelmed as the country urbanizes. We have a world-class financial system, privately run financial system with deep pockets, and a vibrant private sector and global companies. In short, this is a country with great people, but it has to be said, not so great politicians. And sadly, we are squandering our potential and not dealing with the appalling apartheid legacy nearly effectively enough. So South Africa today is indeed in deep trouble. We have a country that is well over 50% living in poverty and getting higher in the last 10, 12 years. We have one of the world's deepest unemployment crises, which is, as my organization has called it, catastrophic for the people concerned, for the country, for our economy. we have effectively a stagnant economy with very little new investment taking place. Our education system is, I think, one of the great failures of the democratic era. We wallow at the bottom of almost every international comparative table for basic education, and our skills system of vocational education is expensive and not very effective. And I could go on through housing and health. Housing, we did quite well in the first 10 years of democracy, but not anymore. It's totally unaffordable the way we have approached the housing challenge. And inadvertently, instead of bringing our cities together and desegregating, we have totally without this intention created more sprawling cities where the poor are even further away from economic opportunities. Today we're struggling to have the power we need to drive our economy, never mind our households and our normal needs, and that is having an effect on water supply in the metropolitan cities and in the sort of rural towns as well. Our local government system is falling apart in many, many places. The metropolitan areas, I'd say 6 of the 8 are still okay, but not doing fantastically. But around the country, there are far too many dysfunctional local governments with sewerage running in the streets. And then we have failing state-owned companies which insist on a monopoly of service provision, and they don't provide the services, and those they do are very expensive. And then we have a national cabinet and senior levels of government that, well, to be polite, are not able or willing to run the country effectively. As you can see, I'm on my best behavior. So why is South Africa in this terrible situation? Now, the country was always going to be a hard place to govern. After apartheid, deep discrimination, inequality, and all the legacies that we had. But 27 years on, why are we in such trouble? So the current president likes to talk about the cause of our troubles as being 9 wasted years. And by that he means the period when South Africa was governed by Jacob Zuma. What he neglects to tell you is that he was the deputy president for 5 years of those 9 and played a very important part in government as deputy president of the country. Obviously, the 9 wasted years resulted in what's called state capture, effectively the looting of state budgets, the undermining of institutions vital for our society and our economy, where people were put in place solely to loot and not to run these institutions, and many of them didn't have the capacity to do that. They undermined our revenue service, and most notably, but there are many other institutions, most notably Eskom, the power utility, but also Transnet, which deals with the ports, rail, and ports and rail mainly. So that's one explanation, which frankly I don't think is nearly sufficient, and I'm not buying that. We then have had President Ramaphosa for the last nearly 5 years, who came into office as a reformer. There were many people desperate to believe this. They wanted to separate the man from the party he has been a part of all his life, and that somehow he would change South Africa. It hasn't worked that way for a number of reasons. I think some reforms have taken place, far too slow, far too little, and just not nearly bold enough. In many ways, you could say we have a flailing government and a flailing reform strategy. We are not a failed state. There are pockets of excellence that remain in the state, but I sometimes say that the notion of the current president as a reformer for the country is a mirage. It's just not going to happen. And as a senior businessman, I interviewed some 10 days ago a senior black businessman who was chairman of Eskom in better days, has been chairman of the Public Investment Corporation, and many other places in our country. He said he thought that the president was irresolute and didn't have the courage of his convictions to actually take on the corrupt in his own party and lead South Africa, never mind his party, in a new direction. But the third explanation for why we are in such trouble, in my view, is bad policy, whatever the technical name is for that. And I'll highlight three things. The first is that ever since they came to office, the ruling coalition of the ANC, the Communist Party, and the largest trade union movement in the country have believed passionately in a developmental state. And you can understand why, because of our history. The state under apartheid did all sorts of things for white South Africans and did terrible things to black South Africans, and not nearly enough to help develop individuals or provide opportunities for black South Africans. So there's a reason for this passionate commitment to a developmental state, which is never really defined, but they want the state to direct the economy and lead the society. And this is all very well if you have a state, but with a collapsing, weak state, riddled with corruption, whatever your view, it's impossible to even imagine the state leading South Africa today. They're unable to do, the current state is unable to do the most basic things, from policing to preventing insurrection to fixing the potholes on our national roads. But the concept is of a much bigger state, that somehow an Asian type state or an East Asian type state that can direct the economy. And even as state-owned companies collapse around us and we sit in the dark without any power, yet the ruling party says the state will lead South Africa, the state will direct the economy, instead of a very different kind of developmental state that facilitates growth. So that's the one delusion, in my view. The second is an active policy of what's called cadre deployment, which is essentially that we need party people to be in charge of almost every institution throughout South Africa that is run by the state. And it's not as though you need to be a highly trained, competent engineer, and then you can get the job. The most important criterion is that you are a party loyalist. And so we have people in very prominent positions who are not able to do the job even if they weren't corrupt. And there are some people who are not corrupt, but if you combine failure to really understand how to run large systems in a complex, sophisticated economy with the most important criterion being loyalty to the party, you can see some of the explanation for what is happening. And to this day, there is debate within the ruling party about cadre deployment, with some people saying it's time for it to go, but the president firmly committed to this policy, and he was chairman of the cadre deployment committee at the height of state capture. The third important reason why South Africa is in trouble is a failure to really understand the power of markets, of entrepreneurs and firms. And when you think of South Africa's advantages in having a reasonably sophisticated and robust private sector for a developing country, this is an even greater loss of opportunity. So today we sit with, for example, one of the largest state-owned companies, Eskom, producing a third less power than they did in 2008 at more than 3 times the cost. I could go on, but I'm sure this will come up in question time. We have the president committed to much more infrastructure, investment and development when he came into office, but since 2018, when he did come into office, there has been no major state-led infrastructure project since then, although the private sector is eager to invest. So that's the bad news, and I am one of the optimists. Let me pull this together and talk about some positive developments or possibilities. We have a good constitution in South Africa, a democratic constitution. It is not perfect, but it is holding, and it's performing in many important ways. There are few other countries where, because of our constitution, because of our independent judiciary, the president would have sat in front of the Deputy Chief Justice in the Zondo Commission, having to account for his actions as Deputy President of the ANC or as President of the country. These are positive things. We still have a private sector that is committed to the country and has the ability to mobilize enormous resources and to really help South Africa. And this was evident during COVID, where I think, unlike almost any other country we know of, the private sector played a remarkable role. And then lastly, and most importantly, we have increasingly competitive politics in the country. From 1994 till about 2016, South Africa's elections were, you might say, racial referenda because of our past. But now increasingly, we are seeing competition for power at our polls. The ANC is losing support in the cities, and they no longer hold a majority. And in the last local government elections, they got below 50% in the elections. So there is more competition. There are more political parties emerging, which may or may not be a good thing, but it adds to the competitive flavor. Many of these are black initiated and black led, which is important in South Africa's politics. So, Mr. Chairman, South Africa is today in deep trouble, but we have the capacity to surprise everybody, as we did in our democratic transition, which nobody predicted, the peaceful, relatively peaceful nature of that. We're heading towards elections in 2024, and I think there's everything to play for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. Alan, over to you to start the conversation.
Okay. Well, thank you, Anne. I think that was a very frank and very hard-hitting analysis here. And what I liked was that, you know, amidst all the gloom, which we see, you've put your finger on some very, very, very powerful strengths. And I agree with you. I think that the Constitution, the judiciary, have actually been a remarkable strength. I mean, many countries, including, I would say, many rich countries, could learn about accountability of previous presidents from South Africa. We won't mention any names, but we can imagine. And I think you're quite right in that, you know, it does have this asset. It has a very strong business community, actually, for a country of this type. And it has capacity. And at the same time, it has had this trajectory of decline, of undermining of the state, of weakening of state capacity. And what I think would be useful is to talk a little bit about how you could imagine the country moving out from this area. Obviously, this is speculative. And, you know, Stefan Durkon has just written a new book. And the book is about elite bargains, that if you're going to have a consensus towards development, you need some kind of bargain coalescing around the important groups in the society. And in South Africa, it seems that would have to be part of a political realignment, given what you're saying. Is how can you imagine that kind of bargain playing out? And what are the roles of certain important actors. I'm thinking, for example, of the trade union movement. I mean, how do you, if you had been from the trade union movement sitting here, how would you have seen this playing out? So can you give us an idea of the diversity of views and how you see this possibly playing out down the road?
Well, this is everything in the kitchen sink in one question.
Yeah.
So let me make some terms clear. The president has been talking endlessly about what South Africa needs is a social compact. He keeps getting compacts and then he wants more. The beginning of this year, he wanted a social compact. It wasn't quite clear what this was supposed to do, but I think this is a terrible way to govern South Africa. And I think what Durkon is talking about is very different.
Yes.
So that's the first thing, if there are any South Africans listening to this. South Africa is in such a deep hole that it is hard to see how to move forward. I think there's some principles that I'd start with. The first is the state is so weak that there is increasing, I think, consensus among certain quarters that you have to bring the private sector in. We might not like them, they might be all sorts of things, but there's a bigger role for the private sector. That's good. And if the trade union was sitting here, well, firstly, the trade unions themselves have divided. So COSATU has lost some key unions to two other trade union organizations. So the trade union movement is not what it was in 1994, number one. And number two, it is increasingly dominated by public sector workers. There are others, but that's a key trend. I think they'd agree with a lot of the diagnosis, except they still, parts of the unions, still want a developmental state. So one of the problems in South Africa is part of the magical thinking is if the trade unions were sitting here, they'd probably agree on the weakness of the state today. Useless at this, that, the next thing, corrupt, da-da-da-da-da. But then they jump from that to the state must do A, B, C, D, E. And when you say, well, maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, if we really work hard together at building a competent, professional, effective, smart state, maybe in that time. But what do we do now? And I think there are a lot of people who don't want to face the reality of now. Now, it's hard to imagine this state leading reform because they're so weak. And that makes it a very difficult set of questions. So as you can see, to answer, South Africa is in paralysis, partly because it's hard to answer your question. And that's why I'm saying that the places to look for possibility are competitive politics, because maybe we can get a different form of government in 2024, and maybe you could make it reasonably stable, but that's a big set of ifs. And then secondly, there are people in South Africa who know how to run big systems. They know how to fix the trains or the ports. We have product, not just minerals, but agricultural products sitting at our ports for day after day after day because we don't have capacity to get them out or because the port isn't working properly. And the private sector have said, for example, in the Cape, the citrus industry has said, we will expand the port. Let us do it. But the notion and belief in the developmental state, because easier to loot, but also for ideological reasons, holds us back. So you do have people in the country who can fix South Africa, obviously in partnership. That's going to have to be in partnership in some effective way where you can bring the skills and resources of private players together with the political players. But how you get there is very complex.
Yeah. I think, if I'm right, the power sector is one where we've seen an entry now for private provision of power. Can you comment on that at all? Breaking Eskom's monopoly.
So South Africa, we always like to say it's a terrible thing, but we like to go to the brink of disaster, and then we look over the cliff and then we say, there's another road to go here. And one answer to you is, in part, that's what we're doing on power, but I'm not so sure. So one of the few areas where the president has been bold is, contrary to the wishes of his Minister of Energy, he has said that the private sector can now produce a lot of power independently, use it for their own needs, if you're a mining company or a factory or something, and then pass on as much as you want to the national grid. Okay, so we've got that. The regulations and all are sort of take longer than one would expect when we don't have the power that we do. So you kind of get announcements and then you wait, because they're not actually implemented with any sense of urgency at all. So yes, the notion is we are going to get private producers of power. They can actually supply. Municipalities have been given the right to look for private sources of power, but the fine print hasn't yet gone through, but that's going to happen. And so there will be more private sector provision of power. Is there an understanding and a clear commitment to developing a really competitive market for power, and what that means for the grid? I think that's still a bit further down the road, but the crisis is such now that there are movements in this direction. I personally am. Yes, there is starting to be, I think there are 3 big projects of private sector money that have now been signed off and are about to commence. But if you compare to the size of the crisis, the kind of movement in this direction is not nearly fast enough or clear enough. But it's starting. It is starting.
I want to just follow up on that and come back to the question of, ultimately, the state and the capability of the state, it seems to be the thing that keeps coming out. So we have now COSATU, we have the ruling ANC that supposedly, as you said in your analysis, see the role of the state as more a developmental one. Does the DA or the EFF see the state differently? Because if the politics are to become competitive so that there's a different push in terms of how the country goes, then it has to come from somewhere outside of them. And so if the politics are becoming competitive, do we see this emerging in the DA or the EFF?
Well, you're asking 2 things about the competitiveness of the politics, but also on their attitudes to the state.
That's
Let
right.
me start with the latter. So in my view, the EFF, all the polls are showing that it's plateaued at about 10-11% of the population, which is a good thing for South Africa. I think they're a deeply worrying phenomenon, but I don't see their growth getting much higher than that, but anything's possible.
Right.
I think this is a corrupt and violent and racist and fascist organization, to be polite. So what is their view of the state? I don't really know. They change their policy position week after week, so it would, whatever suits them. And they certainly don't want an independent judiciary and all the things that we would want in a democratic country. The Democratic Alliance, on paper, is certainly committed to a smaller, more capable state, but are certainly not libertarian by any means. So they would want a state that can do the job. They would like to privatize a lot of the state-owned companies, and they certainly run the Western Cape, one of the provinces of South Africa, much better than the rest of the country. And that would be it's acknowledged by all government kind of investigations into how the provinces are performing, and you can see it in the statistics. So it's a very different philosophical view. As we know, when people get power, their inclination to reduce their power base is with less enthusiasm, but certainly philosophically, that's where they stand. So in terms of their attitude to the state, that's how I would see that. In terms of more competitive politics, look, we're 18 months before a general election. The most reliable polls are showing the EFF, as I said, it's plateauing at about 10, 11%, irrespective of turnout. You know, it could be 55% of voters, could be 65%, whatever. They sit at that place, as does the DA, interestingly, at 25%.
Okay.
So nobody's quite got enough yet. There's some smaller parties, maybe getting you to perhaps another 10%. But the DA is very clear. The official opposition in our system has made it very clear they will not go into alliance with the EFF. And that means that the ANC has to come down a lot more, below 45%, to even start a conversation about a coalition government in 2024. We're not there yet, but there's a lot that can happen. And as Alan says, South Africa's on a trajectory in the wrong direction. What is that? How does that play out with voters? Plus, there are some new parties. There is going to be a new party early next year. And I think these are going to be people with views much closer to, they'll package them differently, but views much closer to the DA.
Okay.
And if they do that well, who knows what they might get. I don't think we should be unrealistic about that. But as the ANC, they don't even have the money to pay their own staff at head office. So this is a party in deep trouble. It's hard to see how this plays out before the next election. It's an unknown.
Fair enough. Alan?
And on the DA, just a quick question before going on. To what extent do you think the DA has managed to surmount the image that it's a white party? I mean, this has always seemed to me to be the critical limitation for the DA. They've been losing some quite prominent black members recently. And while that's the case, I suppose, you know, you have to look to DA-like parties, which are not in that same bucket.
That's right.
So to what extent do they have the possibility of surmounting that barrier?
Well, let me start, before I answer this, by stressing that I run a non-party political organization.
Fair enough.
Which gets increasingly difficult as South Africa's troubles mount. So let me state that. As an objective outsider, I would say a few things. Firstly, South Africa's tragedy at the moment is that the ruling party is dying. And the only questions are how much damage it does while it dies. I don't think it can be revived. There are some people who think that. I don't think so. And how long it takes to die. Those are the issues there. Our tragedy is the opposition isn't strong enough to be ready to govern. That is the dilemma. So that's the first point. The second point is, I think that two things about the DA. The one is that, objectively speaking, they get an appalling press. Now, you could say, you know, how they are talked about, perceived in the media is, in my view, very biased. From little things like, instead of in any normal country with our kind of political system, you would always talk about the official opposition first before other opposition parties. Not so in South African media. It's the EFF first and this one and that one. Oh, and the DA, which happens to be the largest opposition party. But there are other things as well. So you can have, when the DA, after the 2021 elections, the DA were most unexpectedly, South Africa surprised, they were elected mayors in the most important metros in Gauteng, the
Right.
heart of the economy. And two of those let's say there were three, two of the mayors were black. But you would read articles in independent newspapers, the Daily Maverick and others, which would start with, why does the DA have no black leaders? But you're looking at mayors who are black. And there are many, many examples of that. So the DA actually has quite a large number of black leaders within the party structures. However, it is true that they have lost prominent black leaders. Well, they've lost black and white leaders, but we only talk about black leaders in this context over the last period, which is not good. Now, bear in mind the ANC is now almost 100% African party, also not talked about. Minorities have deserted the ANC, but we don't really talk about that. So there's a particular focus on the DA, and it's an understandable one. You know, how can you govern kind of thing, and where is the black support? They now have, according to the latest polls, more black support than they've ever had. It's not substantial, but more than they ever had. And there are black leaders within this party, but they do have an image problem and I think a reality problem, which is puzzling and is a problem.
Yes.
May I just? I mean, I'm sorry that we've stayed so long on on this question, but if the ANC is hemorrhaging members, right? Because the ANC, it was. I mean, when ANC went below 50%, it was news. It was an event. So if the ANC is reducing members and the EFF is plateaued at 10%,
What's happening?
where are the people?
Okay, so the first thing to say is the ANC isn't hemorrhaging members so much as voters. Big difference.
Okay.
Number one.
Okay.
Number two, in the last election, well, certainly the 2016 election, 3 million people who one assumed used to vote ANC didn't vote. So the numbers of people who are not vote. So look at South Africa. I'm sure it's the case in a number of other countries, but the potential number of people who can vote, I think, is about 36 million. The number of people who don't bother to register is very high. Then the number of people who register and don't vote is very high. And then eventually you end up with those people who pitch up and vote, and you get effectively a minority government. But my view is if you don't bother to vote, you don't deserve to be counted. But so this is a complex situation. So what is happening is two things. The ANC is losing voters, many of whom are sitting it out. So can current parties or new parties persuade those people of the value of voting? One big question as we head to 2024. Can the ANC persuade them to come back and vote for them? So that's one issue. And then the second is, in the local government elections in 2021, there were some, you might call it, black voters who went to the opposition, in growing numbers. Not big enough to be able to take power, but there is a movement. But there are large numbers of people who are not bothering to register or to even vote, and people who previously supported the ANC who are not voting. Now you can tell this from what they say, but also where they live, and so on. So it's a complex. South Africa is a complex country, and sort of more sophisticated than many people allow for.
And I'd like to ask you, turn the conversation to something that I know you and your institute have worked on, which is the question around unemployment and social policy and inequality. And of course, this is a complex area. You have labor market legislation, including minimum wages. You have a very expensive system of social grants, and you have pressure for more grants, particularly some form of basic income grant. And, you know, you can look at this from the countryside or you can look at it from the bottom up. And if you think about the bottom up, you're trying to give hope to people that there is a way forward. And how do you do that? And how do you see this discussion and the whole question of trying to use the social grant system to encourage, if you like, more, maybe alleviating poverty, but also encouraging more efficient use of human resources? You talk to us a little bit about that.
Oh, another big topic.
Yeah.
So when the ANC came to power, one of the key themes of their approach to the economy was we want high wages and high skilled, a high skilled, high wage economy. Well, that would be fine if you really put effort and success into training people, even from 1994, but we haven't. And if you had, you still wouldn't have got very far that way, because so many of our population, our current workforce, through no fault of their own, come out of very bad schools, and our sort of emerging workforce through the democratic era also have come out of very bad schools. So we have a workforce that is not high skilled, and they're not able to do the high-tech jobs that all the people who like to lecture us on the kind of fourth industrial revolution, whatever that is, sort of go on and on about. That is not South Africa's big challenge. Our big challenge is, Alan, as you know, it's to get as many people as possible onto the first rank of employment in the modern economy and get them, in a sense, as Paul Romer would put it, work as school. You get a second chance to learn all sorts of things on the factory floor or on your first job. And that's what this debate in South Africa, which has taken many forms, is all about. So when people say decent jobs, I like to quote the former Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel, who said once that the more adjectives you put in front of the word jobs, the fewer jobs you get. And I agree with him. South Africa is a perfect example of, it's not the case that if you hold out for higher paying jobs, you will get them. We're a perfect example of actually you get no jobs at all. So the way in which our economy has sort of haltingly grown in the last 14, 15, 16 years is, if anything, in the higher tech sectors, not in the lower sectors of the economy. And our rules and regulations are almost designed to not do that. So we favor, through the labor market rules, we favor negotiation at the top end of the economy in factories and workplaces, and then the unions have the right to persuade the minister. She can say no, but generally doesn't, to extend those conditions and wages to everybody in the sector. A terrible idea. So on the one hand, our labor market doesn't favor labor-intensive activity, and we're not fixing our vocational education and schooling system to move people to become a more skilled workforce. So we like to say South Africa needs jobs for the workforce we actually have, not the one we wish we had. So this is so that's one set of issues. I think the second set of issues, which is we don't talk about as much, is how far away from economic opportunity poorer people are. It's whether they're in the cities, in perhaps even a house provided by the democratic government, but they're further away from where the core economic opportunities are. Or you're in a rural area or a former Bantustan, and the cost of transport prevents you even getting to the job interview. Never mind the job. So we have to look at how we structure our society, both the labor market, but also how we give people access to the modern economy. And then thirdly, we have to lift the restrictions that hold back new firms starting in any endeavor, from high end to low end, to just expanding existing firms, new investment. We're getting a whole lot of those things wrong, and the people who suffer the most are the poor.
Well, at this point, we would like to, open up for audience questions. Hopefully, some from online. If we're not getting them, we still have a long list of questions that we have here for Anne. But that's the few people in the audience want to give him a chance if anyone has a question. All right, Prashant.
Yay.
Thank you. Thanks, Anne, for coming and sharing your views. I guess I have two questions. The first is, in the decline that you're describing, and some people would argue that non-state actors are equally at fault,
Yes.
including enterprise in South Africa. And is business in South Africa doing sufficiently to play their role in advancing the strength of government, the strength of South African democracy? There are many levers we see here in our country, in the United States, that businesses since the last 4 years or 3 years have taken a much more important role in doing that. Is that happening? Is there a way to make business as an enterprise play a stronger role, getting more of the people to come? Michael Porter talks about politics and barriers to entry for the right kinds of candidates, and how can we systematically reduce those barriers to entry for the right kinds of candidates, including at the ANC. So that's one question. What's happening on the side of the business? Are they doing their part? Do you think there is more for the businesses to do? The second is South Africa's role in Africa. And many people look towards South Africa when we talk about African integration projects, many other things. It boils down to two things predominantly. One is South Africa's dominance in global value chains that exist on the continent. And the second is immigration going into South Africa. So your views on this point about South Africa's role in African integration. Thank you.
Great. Well, CGD likes very complex questions, so let me try and... So on the first issue, I'm delighted you raised it because I wanted somebody to do that. There are a whole lot of points I would make. The first is, yes, takes two to be corrupt, or three to be corrupt, and some companies in South Africa, some international companies, played an appalling role in the whole period of state capture. You'll know that Bain, for example, has been banned from business with the UK government, and South African Treasury has also banned them from interacting with, doing business with South Africa's government. Perhaps you could put some pressure in America as well. They behaved appallingly. And there were others. McKinsey is now being charged, and a few others. So I absolutely, there's no concept of it's only the public sector that was corrupt and not the private sector, and this needs to be cleaned up as well. The courts should do their job, and people should go to jail if they are found guilty, whether they're in the private or the public sector. I'm delighted, for example, that one of the biggest corporate scandals in the country, nothing to do with state capture, but with a publicly listed company, finally they are starting, the Reserve Bank is moving on the key person involved in that massive failure of governance and fraud. So we have a lot of homework to do. That's the first point. South African business, on the one hand, plays a remarkable role in the country outside the factory gate. where when I last looked at the numbers, South African firms were like third after American, Canadian firms in terms of how much money they were giving to whatever you want to call it, social investment. And it's partly tax deductible and some of it isn't. So they do not only pay their taxes, which we shouldn't forget, which is a major contribution, but they also give back in that sense. Now, how well it's spent and so on, we can have a long debate about that. So that's very important. Let me give you an example. During COVID, immediately the private sector set up a special fund, a tiny amount from government, but it was billions and billions of South African rand that was donated to help small firms, to help communities, to help the country in dealing with the pandemic. They certainly did their part there. And as I said, in a way that, well, I don't know, but we haven't heard of many other countries where the private sector has done that. So they're good at that. They're remarkably good at that. Business also, at the same time as raising all that money, put together all these, I like to joke, lots of the consulting companies who did bad under state capture were enrolled. Rather bizarre idea, but enrolled to start thinking about a reconstruction plan for the country. And business, it was called Business for South Africa, came up with a long and very detailed plan on sector by sector how we could recover economically and what to do and what they would do and investment. And we were part of this initiative. I don't agree with a lot of it, but it was a very massive contribution, which has actually been recognized by the former president of the country, Thabo Mbeki, partly to attack the current president. He said, "You don't have a plan, look at businesses' plan, take their plan." So they certainly, over and above normal business activity, they certainly did a lot. What do they do now and what should they do? A very complex set of questions. But I think in terms of that question, there's a lot to talk about in terms of business and exactly how they deal with the corrupt among them in terms of shame and those sorts of issues we could discuss. So not a perfect record, but certainly committed corporate citizens, which could be taken, how can I put it? Which, if we had the right state, they could push them even further. In terms of your second question, I'm not an Africa specialist at all. Let me deal with migration, one of your big issues. So we've thought a lot about migration policy for South Africa, and there's absolutely no doubt the country needs a more effective policy. It needs to be within the human rights of our constitution, and it needs to be effectively implemented. Now, we are getting a lot of, whatever words you want to use, documented, undocumented, legal, illegal immigrants into the country. It's not quite clear what the numbers are. We had a lot of money about 10 years ago, and we tried to count this more effectively. And what you know always is that the academics' estimates of the numbers are much lower than the politicians or the bureaucrats who are trying to get more money for the police or their department. So I don't really have a good feel of the numbers. Now, I think what has happened is this has not been well managed. So you get the poorest communities in the country, often in urban areas, absorbing large numbers of migrants who compete with them, and that raises issues of fairness, of public policy, corruption, and resource allocation. So it's a very complex sort of pool of issues and a whole lot of very important development questions that come out of this about small businesses and how come foreign small businesses have found opportunities in our townships that maybe others haven't. Why? What is the structure? Why are South Africans learning from exposure to these new, let's call them, chains operating at lower levels of our economy. What's going on? So there are lots of policy issues. The bottom line is South Africa does not have an effective refugee or migration policy. They've been derelict. This has resulted in appalling xenophobic outbursts, which the government then mumbles and says, oh, we're going to tell everyone to be nice to each other. It's no good being nice to each other. There are fundamental interests at stake here. And the South African policy, we don't man up, whatever the word is, we don't deal with our borders effectively. And we have a lot, so as you know, this is a very complex issue. We're not first in class. We're handling it very badly. And then how it plays out in our poorer parts of our cities is being managed badly as well. So lots of work to do, and we could talk about what to do, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. We're closing in on the hour mark, and so Alan, did you have another question for Anne?
Well, let me finish with a final question. How do you see the issues surrounding the current president, and what are the implications of that for the ability to guide the economy? I'm talking about Filergate.
Sure.
Or implement the reforms of the
Or
Zondo.
implement reforms.
Of the Zondo Commission.
Yeah.
Well, the current president is heavily focused on December, when the ANC has its 5-yearly Congress and they elect the president and the top 6, it's called, of the ANC. So his mind is firmly on that. I have no knowledge of the ins and outs of what's called the Farmgate scandal, where millions of dollars are reputed, alleged to have been found on his farm. This is contravention of our Forex rules, but also, well, it's alleged, hidden in the sofas, alleged, and then it's alleged he didn't report it. He says he reported it he's obviously surrounded by police and security services, and he reported it. Did he, didn't he? So there are endless questions. There's something like 7 different investigations from different parts of the state into this event, or series of events. The cover-up, was there a cover-up, wasn't there, what happened, etc. So how this plays out and by when, we don't know. So Parliament's looking into it, the Reserve Bank, the police, and all sorts of, Parliament has a number of institutions looking at this. It's complicated. If you made me bet today, as a foolhardy person, I would say, I think the odds are very good he will be re-elected president of the ANC in December. They have a rule, which is now sort of half implemented for some people and not for others, which is if you are charged, you can see the problem of the ANC. They have to discuss at great length issues like, how do we deal with corruption among ourselves? So if you are charged by the National Prosecuting Authority with a crime, you have to step aside from your position. He has not yet been charged with anything. Will he be? I really don't know. I think it's fair to assume it won't happen before December. Will there be another revelation about something we don't know? It's also possible between now and December. So the president is an enigma. He came to power, he appointed a committee to look at Eskom and what he should do about it. Absolutely the right people, excellent people, reported to him February 2019, never released, he didn't do what they said he should do. Complicated in terms of race and skills, complicated in terms of who in the upper echelons of the ANC is corrupt and so on. But he didn't do it. He knew what to do, he didn't do it. He appointed a committee, maybe solid people, to look at the security cluster post-Zuma. He got that report December 2018. He didn't do anything. We now learn that he learned there were people loyal to the former president with a slush fund, buying guns. Didn't do it. So what do you make of all of this? As a reformer, I think he's done one or two brave things. He did at the beginning set up a commission to look at the revenue service, which was a world-class institution, totally gutted by the state capture Zuma people. He set up the right judge to be in charge of that. Within 6 weeks, that judge said, fire the CEO, he's a crook, I can tell you straight away, do it. And he did it. And then that report came out, and there is new management there who are trying to fix things. And he did one or two other things, but those are exceptions. And in terms of reform, yes, he's been pushing. Finally, on the reform, he made some of the changes. But will he fire the minister who disagrees with him and is not very competent at implementing what needs to be done? No. Has he fired any minister for incompetence? No. We have a police minister who thinks that his job is to appear at crime scenes after the event. But that seems to be all he does. So what kind of reformer is this? What is the game plan? It's very hard to understand, and that's why I quoted a leading black businessman who was the first in corporate South Africa, 2012. In his chairman's report, he said, we are being governed by a very strange bunch of people. And they shouted and screamed at him, and he stood his ground. And his view is it's a question of resolution, to stand up for what you believe, and courage. And that's what we're lacking.
Well, and on that note, on that very hopeful note, we would like to bring our conversation today to an end. The conversation will be available on our website. And the video will also be available on the website of the Center for Development Enterprise in South Africa. Yeah. And thank you for being here with us, Alan. Thank you. And to our guests, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much.